Hi, I'm Damon Fairless.
Manitoba, my dear, sweet Manitoba, look at what we have done here tonight. You know, a lot of people in the big cities, they look down on us here in Manitoba. Flyover country, they said. Winnipeg, man, it's cold out, they said. But look what little old Manitoba did tonight.
That's Manitoba NDP leader Wab Kinew on Tuesday night. Kinew led his party to a majority win in the provincial legislature, and so he's now set to become the first First Nations premier of a Canadian province in our 156-year history. It was pretty much a two-party race from the beginning. The Progressive Conservative Party, the PCs, had been in power since 2016, and its leader, Heather Stefanson, Kinew's main opposition, has since stepped down. So this is a significant political turn for the province. CBC Manitoba's provincial affairs reporter, Ian Fraze, has been covering it all, and he's here with me now for more on what Wab Kinew's historic victory means for Manitoba and the rest of Canada. Hey, Ian, thanks so much for coming back on Front Burner.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ian, one of the really compelling moments in Kinew's victory speech is when he addressed young Indigenous people in the province.
But I want to speak to young Nietzsche's in particular. I was given a second chance in life. And I would like to think that I've made good on that opportunity. And you can do the same. Here's how. My life became immeasurably better when I stopped making excuses and I started looking for a reason.
It's especially poignant considering that Kinew's own father was a residential school survivor who wasn't allowed to vote as a young man.
And so to young people who are looking for a positive path, I want to share the words that my father always told us. Ando buachigek. Seek your vision. Seek your vision. Dreams come true.
So I guess what I'm wondering is how significant is this win for Indigenous communities in Manitoba and even beyond?
It is pretty significant. In some ways, this is seen as a step towards reconciliation, that a province in Canada will now have its first First Nations premier. You know, in that speech, he's talking about, young Nietzsche's and referring to his own, sort of troubled past and saying,
if you want to leave the party lifestyle behind, it has to be you to make the decision. If you want to join the workforce, get a new career, it has to be you to take the first step. I can't do that for you. A government can't do that for you. You have to be the person to decide to take the first step.
But once you do, my government would be here to help you.
Here's what our government can do. If you decide to take the first step and leave the addictions behind, our government will make sure that there is a path to recovery for you.
And I think that matters a lot for some Indigenous people, that they can now see someone like them in a position of power. And then here in Manitoba, and I'm sure we're going to talk about the landfill search a little bit.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that in a bit, actually.
There is such a frustration with the PC government on that piece. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs called for Stefanson to resign.
Citing Article 12 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That article encourages governments to facilitate access to and repatriation of human remains.
And now here's a First Nations premier that's going to commit to that. And that's got a lot of Indigenous people quite happy.
And I definitely want to get into that. I think what I'm interested in right now is this is a guy with a really compelling CV. How did he end up leading the NDP party?
Yeah, he's got quite the varied career. You know, he was a broadcaster,
Basically, the show is making the case that now is the time to fix the relationship between Aboriginal people and the rest of Canada.
a public speaker, an author.
He's detailed this father-son relationship in his new book. It's called The Reason You Walk. And we welcome Wab Kinew to our studio.
You know, early on, a rapper.
Bigger than the boy shot and cop who pulled the trigger. It's a product of our history. How Canada's configure what you figure.
A university administrator, and then he got on this path into Manitoba politics. So he had star power, he had recognition, and then when the NDP sort of had their collapse in 2016, they were in power for 16, 17 years. Once that happened, and Wab Kinew sort of took over the party and has sort of shaped it into his image, and now, this is sort of the realization of everything he's been fighting for a few years. But he is quite the accomplished orator. And because of his...
that comes across in his speech, right?
He's engaging, and I think a lot of people are latching onto that.
He's someone who's talked a lot in the past about his Anishinaabe roots. He's spoken about the systemic discrimination faced by Indigenous people in Manitoba, but he downplayed that for the most part in the lead up to this campaign. Why do you think that is?
I think he doesn't want to be branded ultimately as a First Nations premier. He didn't want to draw attention to it. When he would be asked about questions like, what would this mean to, Indigenous people or for reconciliation, he kept saying,
My goal is not to be the First Nations premier of Manitoba. My goal is to be the best premier of Manitoba.
Him saying in his victory speech, that call out to young Nietzsche's was something, we basically hadn't heard or anything along that line for weeks. And and even in this day after press conference, wasn't really bringing it up. But he did share, a fairly poignant moment about that someone else on the stage there with him was his uncle, who was in residential schools.
You have many questions about what it means for me. Think about what yesterday meant for him, who was in St. Mary's Residential School, who experienced the worst of it in our country's history. So whatever feeling I have pales in comparison to how humble I feel to be.
Now, you mentioned a little earlier, that other aspects of his past have come up. He's been really open about this. He had a DUI charge and an assault charge, and then a domestic violence charge. And I should say that the DUI charge was ultimately pardoned and the domestic violence charge was stayed. But these are things that the PC party definitely picked up on as part of Stephenson's campaign. Can you tell me a bit about that?
It is sort of an argument that the Tories have sort of held for a few years, even before the campaign, is that, Wab Kinew is a risk because of his past.
NDP leader Wab Kinew says his past criminal record is no disqualification. Really? Wab Kinew, a risk we can't afford.
And, the results in this election probably shows that, hey, Manitobans believe him, that they believe that he deserves a second chance and that he is a reformed man. The Tories had sort of a tight line to walk when they do sort of allude to this. They do it in a bit of a sly way, right? There were some ads that, cited old news reports about this, but otherwise, there's just talk about Wab would be soft on crime. There were bus benches all throughout Winnipeg with, a police officer who turned out to be a candidate for the PCs, and she's got her arms crossed, and the bus bench says the Wab way is the wrong way, and that violent crime will get worse under Wab Kinew. That being another one. Just the connections between crime and Wab Kinew. Again, you're not directly talking about what happened in his 20s, but you could draw some parallels, and some people were.
Okay, so then there was the PC's take on the Prairie Green landfill. That's just north of Winnipeg. And just for a little background for those who haven't kept up with it. So this is a landfill where police say they believe the remains of two Indigenous women, that Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron, are, and both of them are allegedly victims of a serial killer, but no officials have undertaken to search the landfill to find their bodies. During her campaign, the PC candidate Heather Stephenson had a big billboard sign saying "Stand Firm," and it called the search or any prospective search for these two women's bodies unsafe. It estimated the cost of the search being $184 million. There have been big, high-profile protests calling for the landfill to be searched.
The protesters converged on Portage in Maine, painting a red dress mural on the road and calling on the province to...
Wouldn't this have been a fairly popular issue to get on side with?
Yeah, I think it did definitely surprise people. You know, Heather Stephenson would often, as premier, sort of open the door to things. Hey, maybe this is worth studying. But it was in the summer when she set out and said, no, I will not search the landfill. And, asked 2-3 days later, she was like, no. Like, a term they ended up using was standing firm.
This is about the safety of those individuals who would be conducting the search. I mean, the landfill is full of toxic waste, and in the report itself identified, that there are safety risks, and we are very concerned.
She was standing firm in the summer, months before an election, and perhaps this was an issue they could have, kicked down the road. And there were reasons that maybe people saw that the search wasn't practical. As high as $184 million, that's a lot of money. Finding remains may not be a guarantee. And there would be safety concerns, though the feasibility study did say that, yes, there are safety concerns, but they can be mitigated. The Tories, I think, took a shot at thinking that there might be a silent majority or maybe even just a silent minority that would support them on this issue. And then, as we saw in the last 2 weeks of that campaign, when the attack ads really started to come out, when they were actively campaigning against their opposition to this search.
Why are you willing to put $184 million and Manitoba workers at risk for a search without a guarantee?
They thought that this might be a last-ditch effort and they could maybe get some votes from maybe that silent minority majority.
Mm-hmm. So Crown Indigenous Relation Minister in Ottawa said that the federal government, is going to be putting $740,000 towards further studying how to conduct a landfill search. What's Wab Kinew and the NDP said about searching the landfill?
They have said, from the beginning in the summer that we need to try.
But the bottom line is, out of respect for the families and to line up with the views of the vast majority of Manitobans who are compassionate, we need to make an attempt.
And then actually during the campaign, he has said, yes, we will search the landfill. It's not something they've, promoted in a big way during the campaign. Again, maybe trying to sort of play to the center a little bit. It actually wasn't a part of their costed platform. There was no dollar figure for the landfill search, but it is something he has stressed that we will search. We do have to try. He does not believe it's going to cost as much as $184 million. He says he wanted a second opinion. And now that he is the premier designate, in his news conference the next day, he was asked about what the feds had said, and he was pretty clear, we don't need another study. In his eyes, we need to do this, the earlier the better.
So I'm just going to sum up for a second here. As of this moment on Wednesday afternoon, it looks like the NDP will take 34 seats, the PC's 22, and the Liberals 1 solitary seat. PC leader Heather Stephenson says she's stepping down. So I want to talk about their campaign, about the PC campaign. They seem to have a bigger budget for ads. And early on, those ads were focused on things like economic growth and tax cuts as part of their affordability pitch. But then later in the campaign, things changed, right?
Yeah, that's right. The PC party has, been down in the polls since the pandemic. And, the former Premier Brian Palliser stepped down. Heather Stephenson came in, a veteran MLA. Together with Heather was her slogan that she would be a premier that talks to people and a premier that listens. And she spent the time, sort of opening the purse strings, I guess, spending more money. And that was sort of the through line at the start of this campaign. It's affordability, it's the economy. What we're doing is working. Around midway through that campaign, and just before the main televised debate, the NDP had sort of taken a bigger lead again. And we saw the PCs, perhaps in a last-ditch effort to salvage their campaign, to, take ads that took a bit of they went the attack ad route.
So, one of the things they did was they brought up the parental rights issue a lot, the idea that parents should have more say in what kids learn at school around gender identity and sexual orientation. How did that factor into the campaign?
It was something they just talked about in August before the campaign began, and then weren't really bringing it up. But then, sometime during the campaign, the ads are everywhere, all over Winnipeg on, sort of the garbage and recycling bins. They have one of their candidates, Abhi Khan, sort of speaking to it.
Look, I know I'm biased, but who knows better than us, as parents, what's best for our kids in school? That's why we're the only party fighting for enhanced parental rights for you.
Those ads were, I would argue, a play towards some of the newcomers to Winnipeg living in some of the suburbs that have the potential of flipping. The newcomers that might be a little more conservative leaning, that rubbed people the wrong way. Again, this was a premier in Heather Stefanson who talked about, togetherness, and yet here was an issue that was inflaming, people on the left and particularly members of the LGBTQ community. And then there was an ad that sort of gave the impression that you're alone in the voting booth.
Because during an election, it's okay to disagree on issues without the fear of being judged. So vote like no one is watching, because no one is.
So this is kind of Wab Kinew's election to lose, right? He was the front runner. It seemed clear for a while that the NDP were likely to win and win a majority. What ultimately clinched it for him?
It was a message of healthcare and kind of stopping the austerity that was sort of a hallmark of the first, 5-6 years of the Tories' run in office. And then Brian Palliser stepped down. Heather Stefanson came in. She opened the book. She increased spending everywhere, but it didn't seem to resonate with voters, or they didn't seem to really recognize those changes. On the healthcare piece, though, this is a province where during the pandemic, we had to airlift dozens of people away to intensive care units in other provinces because we ran out of room. And even before then, the Tories reorganized the healthcare system, converting 3 of Winnipeg's 6 ERs into urgent care centers. Just sort of the anger over that, and then the pandemic happened, and then the staffing shortages got worse. So during this campaign for the NDP, it was talking about healthcare almost every day. That message clearly resonated.
And then in terms of affordability, what were the specifics he's talking about there?
He has, again, to maybe take a bit of a centrist bent, which tends to work in Manitoba politics. He's followed the lead of a conservative premier, at least in Alberta, in eliminating the gas tax for a temporary period, at least 6 months, while inflation is still high.
And this is part of a just transition. We need to bring working people along with us as we fight climate change. And right now, that means helping people out at the pump, saving you money.
So he'd, make the price of gas cheaper. And he's also promising to freeze hydro rates for a year. Our renters will get a higher tax credit. And if you want to buy an electric vehicle, the government will give you a rebate.
So that's, as you say, very centrist goals and aspirations. What are the challenges you see for Kinew and his government trying to reach those goals? What do the next few years look like for him?
He is trying to fix the healthcare system. And as we can see throughout the country, fixing healthcare is super hard. He was saying in his day after news conference, same with the landfill search, we have to try. and we have to try to make healthcare better.
Well, should we just throw up our hands and say fixing healthcare is going to be too difficult? Or should we say we are going to have the ambition to make an effort? And that's what
So he's made his biggest task a really hard task. I think another challenge will be in reconciliation. There are a lot of Indigenous people who have high hopes, and fixing some of the issues, the child poverty rates in Manitoba are through the roof. There are, many kids through the CFS system that are taken from their families. Those numbers remain high. Fixing those issues again will take time, but will it be enough, past this sort of honeymoon period he might be getting?
Yeah, it's interesting because as much time and space as the landfill issue is taken up, and it obviously a really important one, there have been Indigenous activists saying, that there's more to reconciliation than this one issue. There's issues with, as you said, education, employment, community support, childcare. So how much work has Wabkanu and his government got to do to make Indigenous folks in the province feel that they're being heard?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. Because in some ways this is uncharted territory to have, a First Nations premier that's leading the province, that gets the issues, whose dad was in a residential school. I do believe he will get some breathing room from the Indigenous community. I mean, there's also a pledge to have, more women's shelters. I think a cabinet committee around the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. I think all these steps are appreciated, and he will get breathing room for a bit, but there will be a desire at some point for, action, and action beyond just searching the landfill.
Okay, Ian, thanks so much. We'll be following it, and it's really great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, that's it for today. I'm Damon Fairless. Thanks for listening to Front Burner. We'll talk to you tomorrow.